Welcome to another episode of Mission Readiness. Today we have Jeff Grieco. I'm so excited to hear what he has to say today. Jeff, please introduce yourself.
Hi, Chris. Thanks so much. You and I know each other from our extended service in the International Stability Operations Association, which is basically a collection of the U.S. government's largest contractors, nonprofit organizations, humanitarian assistance providers, but basically foreign assistance implementers for the U.S. government. I was on the board for about 7 years, and then I'm now on the advisory board. My full-time gig is I'm the head of the U.S. Afghanistan Chamber of Commerce. Still, even in the Taliban era, we're seeming to survive on Afghanistan, which I know we might talk about today a little bit. And before that, I was an assistant administrator at USAID. After 9/11, I went into government, served there for 8 years. When I left, I worked for the largest nonprofit implementer for USAID on Afghanistan and Iraq and Sudan and a host of other conflict state areas. And then I got into ISOA work and met you and met other great implementers.
Yeah, it's interesting, Jeff. I mean, it's very timely for you to be here because of your experience at USAID. Can you talk about what you think is the changes in peace building and economic development that we're seeing?
Yeah, we're really in a pivot point. I mean, we say this a lot, that this is a new step forward in a new direction. But we are really at a tumultuous period in history for the conflict and fragile state operations, contingency operations like ISOA members do. We are suffering from almost 60. If you look at the Global Peace Index, which is put out by a really strong research institute, they measure what are the main indicators of conflict and where are those conflicts at their highest level. We now have this year, in 2024, they just published their results, 60 active conflicts globally. Back when I was in government just 20 years ago, we would maybe manage 6 or 7 simultaneous conflicts. We now have 60 conflicts around the world that are being fed by, we're now in a multipolar world with greater competition. We now have new technologies. AI is causing some of it, drone use. It's easier to do conflict and cheaper in some ways to do conflict. So all of that is creating this pressure that I think the United States is feeling, and that may have led to some of the election results that we have. People want to simplify America's presence in the world, and they see the great amount of conflicts that are going on right now in any region you can name it. So I think this is really the conundrum that we're going to have to deal with. We have an American populace who wants to spend less overseas, less on foreign assistance, and our president, our new president, Donald Trump, has said that publicly. But at the same time, there's more urgency in some of these conflict spaces that could spread and become hot wars for the United States when we actually have to send troops in, which we're trying to avoid by pulling back somewhat. So I think we need contractors and implementers now than we've ever done, but we need to get some new skills and innovations into the implementation. You and I have talked about this before, and I think it's really important that we start professionalizing more inside government the expectations of what U.S.'s role is going to be. We have military, we've got the civilian donor agencies like USAID, Millennium Challenge Corporation, the DFC, TDA, the Trade and Development Authority. All of those need to be reformed now. And just to give you one example, we haven't passed a foreign aid authorization bill since the 1960s.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It's the 1960s. We pass an appropriations bill every year because that money has to be there, and Congress will pass it. But we have tried, and when I was in government, we tried to see if we could get interest from Congress into reshaping the foreign authorization so that Congress would have better tools for oversight, and we would have better ways to work with Congress going forward. I tell you, now is when we need to do a new foreign authorization bill, but it would have to be the president, the House, and the Senate leaders agreeing and committing political capital to get it done.
So, I mean, can you talk a little bit about stability operations? Like, how has it changed from less complicated, fewer conflicts to today, multipolar world?
Well, let's look at Afghanistan. The United States, by the pullout that President Biden did, surrendered the country that we had dedicated a lot of lives to. And we did it, we surrendered it to an organization that was completely a small guerrilla outfit and that we had taken over from in less than 2 weeks back in when 9/11 happened. So you can see that they became more articulate with IEDs, with some kinds of explosives that were targeted at larger populations where they know they could get a bigger impact public-wise and create more fear. And the United States, at a certain point, just said that this is not a country that is a national security risk for us long-term, so we're going to leave and just leave it to whoever takes over. And we see the result now, which is just terrible.
Which seems to be setting the precedence for all these conflicts. We have to decide what we're going to and not going to participate in.
Yeah, and I think it's hard for the American people. We lost a lot of some of my friends, a lot of young boys and girls in Afghanistan, and their parents have the right to ask, why did my son give his life if this was not going to be a commitment of our government long term? And that's really a hard conversation to have, and I think about that a lot when I'm in Kabul even now. I'm going next week.
And I'm glad you brought up Afghanistan. I mean, you, having gone to Afghanistan early after the Taliban took over, can you talk about some of that, some of the difficulties with that some members had?
So in our chamber, we have Afghan Americans who've invested money in Afghanistan during the what we call the Republic years, when they had elected government before the Taliban. Afghan Americans would go and invest in water, bottled water plants and plastic bottle manufacturing, and even energy projects and small energy, like 25 megawatt projects for the people in the country. Those investments, when the Taliban took over, were put on pause. The energy company is still working, and the Taliban have not missed a utility payment to them for the energy they're providing, where the previous government tried to always get them to give corrupt payments to their friends. So a lot of the businessmen now are saying to me, listen, these guys are less corrupt. The country's more secure. I can get in my car in Kabul and drive all the way across to Herat and get stopped once for a check. Yeah. You can do it now. And all my Afghans that stayed, they're feeling like, okay, this is what we wanted, but under the previous government structure. Now, how do we get that previous, democratically elected government structure back? And that's where it's complicated, because the Taliban themselves now have split. So Trump, under his first term, negotiated the Doha Agreement with what we call now the Taliban reformers. These are forward-looking Talibs who wanted to make peace, wanted to have a unity government, and sought to work with the previous government on who would be in that unity government. The agreement gets signed, and then the Taliban, the other part of the Taliban, really the fighting part of the Taliban, who are from Kandahar, we call them the Kandahari Taliban, they started looking at this and saying, why do we have to give up everything if they're willing to give it up? And then when Biden announced, we're just going to leave, they were like, we're definitely not going to do anything. Let them go. We'll take over the country. So now the reformers want to have women in school and girls in school and women working, going to hair salons, going to a park, all these basic human rights that have now been taken away by the Kandahari Taliban, who have all the weapons and the military. The reformers are in Kabul running the government, but with very little military and little support. But what's happened now in the last 6 months, the emir down in Kandahar tried to remove the defense minister, who's from a different part of the Taliban structure, and the rest of the Talibs said, no, you're not going to do that. And so he's now allied with Mr. Baradar, the prime minister, who's a reformer and running the country, and who I met with in Kabul on my first trip back, and other ministers. And they now are getting stronger and more strident in their pushback on the removal of all these rights. And they told me, and I've told you this before, when I went in September of 22 into Kabul, all of my business leaders that are my members wanted me to go because they wanted America
Yes.
to meet them face to face and to tell them what was going to happen, because the Talibs were convinced, the reform Talibs were convinced that, well, they'll be back soon. They'll be back and help us with investment and so forth. And I met with them, and I was very honest with them that there'll be no investment from the United States, from the American people, from our government, or from our companies, as long as you restrict the rights, the human rights, of 50% of your population, which is women and girls. And the reformers who I met with said, wait, we agree. We want the same thing. We want to have girls in school. We want women to be able to work. It's a different part of our, they call it the movement, a different part of our movement wants to do it a religious way. We would like to do this in a more unity-based way, with the old Afghans that were here before coming back and working with us together in a unity government. And I just asked him to his face, I said, you've been here now a year and a half. Things have only gotten worse. Things aren't getting better. You're not making any progress that I can see or that our government can see. The Taliban asked for more time, and they gave me some messages to deliver to our government, and I did. And I feel like the trip was worth it. So when I go back now, and I've been back 3 times, and I'm going next week, it'll be my 4th trip back, I'm likely not going to meet with the Talibs on this trip. I'll meet with all my business people instead, because what has concerned me, I'm hearing out of Washington that President Trump may announce a new set of sanctions on the Taliban reformers, and increasing the sanctions impact to their extended families, most of whom now live in Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Turkey, or Quetta in Pakistan. So if they extend those sanctions, then those reformers are really going to feel the pinch that the Kandahari Taliban, who are almost fully sanctioned, and I can never meet with. I can only meet whenever I go with people who are not sanctioned. I have to check it off with State Department and Treasury Department to make sure I don't see anyone that is sanctioned by our government or by the United Nations, because they both have 2 sanction regimes. I'm optimistic that we could make progress if we had a president who knew what pressure points to push on. I'm not sure President Trump knows that, but if he's willing to increase sanctions, I'm certainly not going to put myself in the middle of meeting with the Taliban when he announces that.
So what is it? I mean, that's a good case study of how investments held up because of their political activities. How do you see Middle East investments proceeding, especially with conflicts occurring?
I see some really positive signs, and I see some really scary signs. So the positive signs for me are Syria. I think there will be a major recovery and reconstruction program for Syria. It'll likely be led by an international group of countries that are committed to that region. It's not Russia. Russia has lost as a result of this. So you'll see Turkey step in. Turkey has fantastic companies, great construction groups. They do everything from energy to cement to construction, et cetera. And they want to have a bigger role in that region, and this gives them the opportunity to do it. And frankly, the United States would like to see Turkey step in a little bit more. They have a good military force. It's well-disciplined. The problems we have are that the Kurds in northern Iraq also want to have Syria become more peaceful and more democratic. The Turks do not like the Kurds and vice versa. So things will have to be worked out, but that's a great example of if the United States is involved, we don't have to do much to lead and help bring people together, and it could be an incredibly effective way to get the region to start working together, including Lebanon, too. I haven't mentioned that. Now, the areas I'm afraid of is Gaza, frankly, and the president's made a very bold proposal on Gaza. I'm not sure how much the NSC thought about it before he announced it, but now they're putting more and more writing and content behind the idea. I think the president's frustrated that he sees so much suffering there over so long a period of time, and yet no progress, and we've spent a ton of aid there. The United States was the largest provider of food to the Gazans, just as we are to the North Koreans and others, but it's rebagged into World Food Program bags and then given out, so the people don't even know that it's American assistance. So I think Gaza is going to be a longer-term problem, and it has the potential to regionalize very quickly.
So let's talk about international organizations. How do you think they're going to change with the U.S. kind of withdrawing from them and going forward?
So the president has said he wants to prioritize. The vice president has said this now. Rubio said it in his confirmation hearings. They want to have a new list of countries that are their national security countries. They're going to commit foreign assistance to those countries, and the other countries will fight over the scraps, I think, basically is where it's going. So there's a lot of countries that get a lot of aid from the United States now that are not necessarily a strategic asset. But we have been with them so long, and they've become a democracy, Ghana and Africa, and they're doing so well structurally that for us to just walk away, it's a question of, the power of American leadership is that we have a brand that we can come in and help people to succeed without a lot of money, I'm convinced. But it takes a strong president to do that. So
But you had talked about these international organizations. It has been costly in terms of executing our programs through them as a third party.
Yeah.
Do you see changes in that, or?
Yeah, so I think the 50% cut in foreign assistance that I see coming will flow through our humanitarian assistance, which largely gets implemented by the UN and large INGOs that contract with the UN. I think some of it will be our stabilization money, and our contingency contracting money will be reduced in some areas. And I think development assistance, which is the pure international development programming that USAID does, will be dramatically impacted because the president and Elon Musk are planning to really cut a significant amount of people from aid. From 10,000, I think now when I left Washington, he had moved the number, the president moved the number up to, all right, he'll keep 800. But you can't run just a headquarters piece with 800 people. It's a 10,000 person agency. And don't forget, we employ hundreds and thousands of what we call foreign service nationals, who are the real experts of the reason the agency is successful.
That's not part of the 10,000?
Right. No. In most cases, no. And then there's contractors that come in, PSCs we call them, in AIDS missions and work on project-based stuff. So if we lose all those foreign service nationals, now I want to say, Secretary Rubio noted last week, but it's still unclear to me, that all the foreign service nationals, there was a cable that went out, would still have a job. It's just not going to be with USAID. It'll be with State Department now. But I can't see how they would keep all those foreign service nationals without a program manager there at the mission to watch how they're implementing and to monitor the programming. So it's going to have a flow all the way through the programming, those cuts. Both people will be hurt. It's not just a resource issue. Our programming will be less effective because we don't have the resources to do what we need to do to be successful on some of these programs, even in a priority country that the president may identify.
If the president wants to prioritize allocations and wants to regionalize support, like Turkey, for example, is there a path forward where you could see it stabilizing despite all these problems around the globe?
It's going to take real leadership by Secretary Rubio because, let me just give you an example, Central Asia. China has moved in big time into Central Asia, and the Russians now are saying to the Central Asian republics, former Soviet satellite states, who now want to be beholden to the West and to the international banking system. That's where they see their markets for their products, is in Turkey and in France and in Europe and the U.S. and Canada. Putin has said to them, after we fix Ukraine, we're going to come and we'll renegotiate our alliance together, these 5 Central Asian republics. 5 out of 5 said, no thanks, we don't want to do that. We're going to keep going the way we're going, we like it, and so forth. We're not sure what Putin's going to do after the war ends in Ukraine, which I think will be done in the next year with a peace deal of some type. But Central Asia should be a place where the United States has not only a presence, but we're in the face of China with DFC competing on projects against the Silk Road and the Chinese approach in those areas. And the Central Asian countries want us, not China. They don't trust China. There's nobody there now. We have one organization in all of Central Asia. It's called the C5+1, 5 Central Asian republics plus the U.S. They have a meeting once a year. And it's just a political discussion. There's no economic integration. There's nothing, hey, here's what the U.S., if we bring DFC in, here's what we can do to help you guys really build a common market, regionalize this, cross-border trade, doing a customs union for the 5 republics so it really becomes an economic engine. We don't have anybody to do that right now, and nobody's paying attention. Central Asia should be a huge priority.
But it may not be a priority with limited resources.
Right.
So you brought up DFC. Could you talk about the changes from OPEC to DFC and from President Biden to President Trump and where you think it's going?
Yeah, so the Overseas Private Investment Corporation was founded, in the 70s, I think. And they and Exim Bank were kind of dual, one for investment overseas and one for increasing U.S. imports and exports. The Exim Bank has carved out a nice role with big U.S. multinationals, and they work very cleverly with them. And nobody in Congress wants to ruin that because it seems to work and it helps our trade for those companies. OPEC became such a bureaucracy that over time, it was less effective at doing what the United States wanted. And when China started moving aggressively into Africa, there was a lot of questions in Congress, and I actually participated in some of the discussions in Washington in the think tanks. What are we going to do about China? Because they're taking our business away in Africa. They're moving in with their own financing. They have the Asian Infrastructure Bank, which is giving out very cheap, inexpensive loans, but then the loan has terms on it that are going to lock them in for 50 years, like Pakistan is now basically a vassal state of China. What was decided, and it started in Congress, but both the Democrat and Republican administrations agreed, we need something else. The first draft of the legislation to change OPEC into the Development Finance Corporation went through a lot of rewriting and didn't get a lot of support. And then they took the bill down and they added China throughout the entire bill. It sailed through within weeks, basically. And the president signed it. So DFC has more power now to do project financing, to do de-risking on major projects. They can do more political risk insurance now than they could before. They can do different types of co-finance and blended finance that never existed under OPEC. And they also have the ability to bring in bigger and better U.S. companies to partner in the deals, which OPEC never really ever was able to do. So DFC has a very high level of expectation, but we're now in year 4 or 5, maybe longer now, the time flies. But I don't think they've reached the scale they need to really be an effective tool for the United States. So I think there is going to be change, Chris, on DFC. This government, this president, is going to push to do a lot more and to make DFC more scalable, faster, more effective at countering China and Russia, frankly, around the world. And I think that's going to come quick as soon as he gets through some of the other things he's doing right now.
Well, okay, you talk about DFC, and we also hear about Sovereign Wealth Fund. Is there a connection between the two or no?
So the president, as you know, is he's a no shrinking violet, and he believes in brand value. He's built Trump as a brand. It's not just a hotel company. He's in 5 or 6 different sectors, and it's Trump in each of those sectors. He knows the value of a brand internationally. What he had the conversation with our new Treasury Secretary, Besson, that he says, listen, United States has a brand value that is investable, that we can monetize for the benefit of the public and build a sovereign wealth fund where we would aggregate large amounts of money over time that could be used for things that are special projects important to the American people that maybe need some kind of separate vehicle to do it. So I think there's a similarity between what he's trying to do there and what he would like to do with USAID and what he'd like to do with, he doesn't want the USAID brand to be USAID anymore. He wants it to be our assistance program, U.S. assistance. That's why he would like to have it in the State Department. And I think most of the leadership offices will likely move into the State Department as well. That's coming. So I think, yeah, there is a link between them. But because the Sovereign Wealth Fund is a new concept, you could see in the Oval Office meeting that he held with the Treasury Secretary, and there was somebody else in the room with them.
Like Ben Black.
Who was it?
Ben Black, maybe.
Yeah, a corporate guy, right? You could see the Treasury Secretary was nowhere near as comfortable about the whole concept as the president was, but that's typical of President Trump. So, yeah, I think something's going to come out of it. I just don't. He's only got, that's another point we should talk about. This president, he has a 4-year mandate. But the reality is, in 2 years, we will have a House of Representatives election. Every 2 years we do. And usually, the party that was defeated in this election, because it was a sweep for Republicans, loses the House. And we're only Republicans in a 2-seat majority right now. So as a result, I think there's an expectation on the president's part that he has to get as much done as he can in these next 2 years, because year 3 and 4 are going to be a huge fight going forward. And that might be linked to Musk's whole role. Musk said that the president gave him only 12 months. And Musk said last week, he said to save $2 trillion. 12 months, $2 trillion. And he released on one of his texts on Twitter or on X, that he's doing 4 billion cuts a day in dollars in recommendations to the president. So the two of them are simpatico because the president has a political objective and Musk only has 12 months. And by the way, he put an offer in yesterday to buy ChatGPT and its parent. So I don't think Musk will want to stay longer than 12 more months.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, let's talk about that. You seem quite balanced on an administration coming in and reviewing programs for 90 days. There's a lot of drastic changes right now. Talk about the pluses and minuses having gone through the similar thing.
So he has not brought in a lot of international development people that know how development and humanitarian assistance programming works. And so if they're going to be in charge of the review and they don't know the programming and how difficult it is, South Korea, can we just talk about that? South Korea was the United States government 50-year project to get South Korea to the point where it was a democracy, even an ugly one. Remember, we had generals for a couple of cycles there. To get them economically, remember the chaebols? Well, they all had to be started with U.S. government money. Hyundai, the Hyundai Corporation, we see Hyundai cars all over. He was a gas station owner fixing U.S. military vehicles, and U.S. government said, if you can build a bigger line to fix our trucks and stuff, we'll give you money to do that. That started his truck business and his car manufacturing. And then they gave him shipping contracts. He's now one of the largest shipbuilders in the world. So U.S. government, it took a long time, and aid was there from the beginning all the way through. And the World Bank has written voluminous histories. Without the U.S. government, the World Bank could never have succeeded in its programming, and the South Koreans wouldn't be where they are today.
Yeah, it's a good
but
point.
It's not 5 years. This is not a 5-year project you can turn countries around. It's a big investment of time, resources, the right people, and there's not a lot of patience in our public, for success. They want to see it quick, and I think our young generation, it's even worse with technology. They think they can get whatever they want quicker, but in countries, it doesn't work like that. It's much more problematic.
But let's talk about that. I mean, you look at China, they have large investments, infrastructure investments, easy to measure, and it appeared like we didn't have the big commitments for big things like that. We don't have those Hyundai projects anymore that we talk about. Is Trump going back to those days where we have bigger investments and less little investments?
I think he's going to get strategic. So I think he'll pick the areas. And I think AI, the announcement he made in the Oval Office 3 weeks ago on AI, that's a major, major commitment of our government and of our private sector and the capital they need to do what they're going to try to do with AI. I'm not sure I really understand exactly what's going to come out of it at the end. But don't forget, the German Marshall Fund. Our whole Marshall Fund for Europe, post-industrialization of Europe after World War II, it took us 60 years to get the Europeans where they were stable, they had good industry, and they could survive on their own market basis. We haven't pulled out of NATO yet, but clearly this president wants to put more pressure on NATO to be able to be the procurement house for the European defense of its own countries. And the U.S. will take a step back from that responsibility. And I think the public definitely agrees with him. It shouldn't have to cost us anything, but it is, of course, because we pay for so much of NATO and the equipment that's used in NATO. So, and we could talk about Ukraine if you want to, because I think that's linked to this.
Let's talk about Ukraine.
So on Ukraine, I think Biden made the right decision early on to send a lot of direct on-budget support, but Ukraine was it was rated one of the highest corrupt societies by Transparency International, which is for many years said that their engineering strength is great, but coming out of the Soviet era, that engineering, a lot of it fled to other Eastern European countries. A lot of them came to the United States. We have a significant Ukrainian population in the United States. But as a result, the corruption we expect in a lot of that direct on-budget support early on has not, we had 3 inspector generals working as a team. The USAID inspector general, the state, and the DOD's inspector generals worked as a team in Ukraine. And after a year of direct budget support, they put out a report that said, we have no idea how we can ever measure and find out where this money went. That was their report. Not, okay, we found corruption, but we don't even know where to look, was their answer. That's not good. That's not good for the United States. And that feeds what President Trump is feeling, that there has to be corruption, and we're going to find it there. That's why he doesn't want to send any more money right now. And I think that's probably a good idea. The World Bank has enough money in its trust fund for Ukraine that the U.S. has put 30% in on, that they'll have money to do recovery programming and stuff for another year or two. But when the formal reconstruction happens, that's when there will be big dollars committed. And U.S. will probably commit some, but only if the U.S. companies are going to be able to get some of those contracts. And right now, they're not.
Can you talk about transparency and accountability going forward? Where do you think that's all going? Is it changing or no?
So I think this administration now is going to focus on both the transparency and the accountability, the reporting of what is not just outputs, but outcomes from the programming. So in USAID's world, where I served for 8 years, they've been beat up by Congress for decades that they aren't focused enough on these outcomes, so that the government, including Congress, who has oversight over the money for those development projects, that they get reports that actually show we're making progress every year. And I think that the Hill feels that they're getting more accountability, more compliance into the programming, but what they're not getting is the transparency piece. And that's come out this week. All you had to do was listen to first Rubio and then Senator Ernst, who is the Government Reform Committee monitor in the Senate. Rubio said, what's upset him the most about aid is that he asked basic questions on where the Ukraine money, who are the people getting, what offices are getting the money, and USAID wouldn't tell him. When I was there, we absolutely told Democrat or Republican, as much as we're allowed to tell them if it's not a classified project, we want them informed and asking the right questions, because it's going to make our team better at the implementation if we know where their prerogatives are on many of these issues. So I think it's been a little bit difficult to get the transparency piece done yet, even though there's legislation that mandates it. It's really, how do we do this now? And you've seen the problems with Musk. He's in looking at payment systems for the government. He's in looking at USAID's foreign assistance payment systems, who gets the money and so forth. And it's not, he's not an expert in development, so he's made statements about stuff that he assumes is corruption, and it's not, because he's confusing 2 different metrics because he doesn't know development very well. But he'll learn, too. I think he's a smart guy, and the people he has around him are smart. And he's partnered with Palantir on some other projects, building accountability systems and stuff as well. So I think there's more that we have to do on that in the United States. On the European side, their publics don't care as much about the transparency for whatever reason. They care more about outcomes, so they're not wasting their money. But our public people like to know where the money's going, and I should be able to get on my computer and know how much development assistance we gave to Uganda last year. That shouldn't be a huge secret for us to do it. So
it does appear, though, that the American populace is changing in terms of their view of development worldwide.
Yeah.
That's part of it, I think.
They do. When you ask them, I think the U.S. Global Leadership Campaign did a survey last week and asked if they support us helping countries to stabilize when they're in conflict and stuff. It depends how you ask that question. The way USGLC asked it, 78% of the American public said, yes, we support that. It was only 22% or something that said, no, we don't support that. So I think it's how you reach to the public on stuff, and and in a very difficult financial world right now where we want to cut. Our government has overspent, clearly, and we have to cut. Our debt is way too high. We're taking away the next generation's future. So there will be cuts going forward, and the question is how deep and for how long will that have an inflationary impact on our economy? What will it do to the world? Will it destabilize allies that have been with us for a long time, but they're not a strategic partner anymore? And now we're putting more resources into other countries that maybe we're not as close to. That all is going to have an impact on our stability internationally and what America can do.
I think if DOGE continues to put lists of projects that were funded by the Biden administration towards the end, some of them are quite embarrassing. I think it'll sway the American public, I'm sure.
Yeah, they're looking at, so Trump has already, it was Rubio and Musk have already said that the programs that will not be funded anymore under their government will be DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion programming. A lot of the woke programming that surrounded some of the gender issues, some of the programming that dealt with women's empowerment, but also included abortion, things of that nature. And climate. We have to talk. Climate is going to be hugely impacted by these cuts. The Biden administration was pushing billions out the door in the last 6 months to anything that would be, quote unquote, named a climate program. And that money now is being analyzed by Musk and the White House and the OMB guys. That'll all, we call it, clawed back because it's been obligated by the previous president. As long as it's not yet dispersed to implementation, OMB can claw that money back and pull it in, and they will.
Did you guys do that like 20 years ago?
We did that, yeah. Every administration does that.
And did you allocate money to those same priorities 20 years ago?
They were maybe different rhetoric, different priority calls. For President Bush, he was definitely impacted by 9/11 and how it happened and how we didn't know about it and what's happening with terrorism around the world more generally. So he had a certain, that's why we got PEPFAR, I'm convinced. It had an impact on the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief. Now that PEPFAR, which I think Rubio has said will continue going forward, but potentially at a reduced rate, PEPFAR up to today has saved 26 million lives of people. 26 million, they actually can categorically count it. The president's initiative on malaria, on polio, saved millions of lives. They're tracking it all the time. That's all USAID programming that's going to be cut now. So there will be an impact, definitely.
Yeah,
I think you and I have talked before, polio was huge in Afghanistan under the Taliban and their previous government in the 90s. The U.S. came in after 9/11. We immediately started polio vaccinations. We got polio down, and Bill Gates joined USAID and co-funded polio eradication in Afghanistan. And we had it, Gates has said that we had it down to 2 people, 2 infections. And if we had gotten those 2 done, we would have wiped it out forever in Afghanistan. Now, Taliban are back, polio is fast rising again. And there's vaccine for it, but the Taliban aren't in favor of some of these vaccines because they think it's a Western plot to harm their children.
But, wasn't there always a relationship between insecure areas and outbreaks of biological threats?
Yeah.
And so with 60 now going on, won't it be even more challenging?
Even more, and Ebola,
Yeah, Ebola.
USAID was the lead on eradicating Ebola when it happened, and was it 2016, 17, I think? But now there's breakouts of Ebola, I heard a couple weeks ago. in Africa. And so it's back again. So if USAID doesn't have the resources to be able to do an emergency plan for a crisis response on that, you have to contain it quickly. And a lot of our ISOA members worked on that, the old PAE guys and stuff, and they saved a lot of people's lives by moving quickly with USAID support. I just fear what's going to come, because if the cuts are too deep, our kids and their generation are going to feel the impact big time. They may not see it right now when those cuts happen, but they will see the impact very clearly later on, and they'll pay for it internationally.
It seems like the approach, though, is, okay, we're going to empower a security partner, maybe like a Turkey, a regional power. We will execute things through them using less international organizations or NGOs and less funds.
Yeah.
That's a challenge, right?
That is a challenge, yeah. And I think that's exactly where it's going, Chris. I really do.
Yeah.
I don't think the UN has a good future right now with this government in the United States, because they know the overhead costs are too high. It's not efficient at implementation, and we can do it a better way.
At the same time, you have China and say Russia and other regional powers coming in, playing into this.
Yeah. Yeah, just trying to get agreement on a simple thing like stopping the Kandahari Taliban from issuing more edicts. We can't get the Security Council at the UN to come to full agreement, and that's a good thing to do. Two of the members, China and Russia, would abstain or stop the vote from happening. How can you be against that? And yet, that's where we're at.
Well, it's probably why helped Mr. Trump get elected as well, this issue.
Yeah.
This week we heard that President Trump is reviewing the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And I was just interested in your thoughts on how did things change in the old days when we entered into agreements or investments with corporations, and how it is today?
Yeah, so the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act started, I think, in like 1974 or something. It was after a large series of international procurements that were done. I think one of them happened to be in Korea, South Korea at that time, where there was major corruption in both the U.S. company paying corruption to government leaders in the foreign country in order to get luxurious contracts that were, in the end, funded by the U.S. back through the South Koreans, for example. So that act created a law that anybody that's going to represent a foreign country, a foreign entity, or do business with a foreign country or a foreign entity has to register what they're working on and provide quarterly update reports to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Office, which is run by the FBI in the Department of Justice. And so they keep very close track of everything every company is doing that way. What the president said, I think, in the last week or so was that that office has become such a burden to companies that companies can't even do their old type of business, which I've told you this about offsets. So in the 70s and 80s, if the United States defense contractor wanted to bid on a Saudi F-16 supply contract, they were allowed under law to do what's called an offset. You have to put it in the contract, a public document that our government reads, the Saudi government reads, that you'll provide 20% of the value of the purchase of these F-16s will go through Saudi-based companies, Saudi businesses that will be working on different aspects, maybe the engines with one company and avionics with another company. That was allowed because it was all transparent and open, and it wasn't a burden. Companies felt, hey, because I'm going to share that with the government anyways, I have no problem doing that. I think that's where the president maybe is trying to get back to, where it's not such a burden that it stops companies from even wanting to bid anything, because they have to have a chain of lawyers filing reports every week. Some big multinationals in the U.S., they might be working in 40, 50 markets. That means 40, 50 separate reporting just for one project. I mean, that's not going to be functional. So I think that's where he's thinking, how can we deregulate this more? Make it more transparent, perhaps, but make it easier for the companies to want to do business.
Yeah. You were talking about transparency. Social media has changed. The digital age has changed. Is that contributing to all these conflicts worldwide, do you think? Or what's your thoughts on that?
I have my own thoughts because I got 4 kids. So I really think social media has not been a beneficial thing for the youth. And I don't think it's been beneficial for adults now either, as we're seeing. So I think social media, well, in some ways, it's allowed people to communicate better to their targeted audiences. What it hasn't talked to the public about, and now, Facebook and these guys, they're now paying big dollar settlements for it. They have trained the algorithms to respond to your worst vices. They can measure your eye contact, they can measure your voice, they can measure different things and structure the algorithm such that it'll elicit a negative response from you. They found that negative responses were able to generate more activity for the person towards what the company that was they were marketing to, than doing positive reinforcement marketing. And so social media has turned kids now into, they didn't realize that they were being put into these I think they understood that it was there, but they didn't understand, how's this really impacting me? And I think it's had a very negative effect, and I'm glad to see more pressure put on these social media companies now.
Well, we see all these insurgencies, and it surprises us that individuals participate into that we would never expect.
Absolutely, yeah. Even Americans that, you wouldn't think are Al-Qaeda sponsors, their social media posts show us. And, it's a new world now for our counterterrorism guys, and I give them huge credit. We have a really strong counterterrorism center in the United States, and they are working very hard to not only monitor our own public to make sure they're ahead of the game on possible terrorist attacks, but they're also monitoring overseas constantly to see if something's coming based on a group. So, and that's constant vigilance. And NCIA's had a role in that, and our national security agencies had a big role in that.
You see all these new programs of way of thwarting this, but you still have legacy stuff like Voice of America and that. Is there roles for the legacy as well as the new, or should we be re-looking at
we tried, like one of the questions came up in the last week was this Sesame Street. So when I first arrived at AID, I found out that AID was giving the Sesame Street workshop most of its money to do its international Sesame Street programming. And I was like, well, is that really, why are we doing that? That doesn't make any sense. So I actually went to the workshop in New York, and I visited them, and I really grilled them. And then I went overseas, and I went into the slums in Cairo, and I asked families why they watched the Alam Simpson, the Egyptian version of Sesame Street. And I had conversations with very poor moms who may have 6, 8 kids in that house with her, and her husband's passed, and that show is her school. They actually educate more adults than they educate youth on those programs. Wow. When we did it in Iraq, it did the same thing. It was educating and making literate huge amounts of the adult population at the same time as bringing the kids along. Okay, I amended my feelings on it. I really thought that in an age where we were having trouble, frankly, with outreach to the Muslim communities around the world after our attacks and after the Iraq invasion especially. But I'm convinced there are things that we can do that may, on the surface, look to our public like, why are we doing that? But I guarantee you there's a lot of detailed analysis. USAID made the workshop provide detailed viewership numbers, attitudinal surveys. We measured constantly how those shows were doing. We had one in Bangladesh. The numbers weren't good. We canceled it. But the Iraq one is still there because it is needed in Iraq. Afghanistan, we had one, but then money got cut because Afghanistan budgets went south. But there's a country that can definitely use it.
I'm sure the costs were reasonable.
Yeah, very reasonable. The way it works, the Sesame Show does, it's 3 interstitials, 3 separate segments. One segment is filmed at the New York studio, which picks a big, broad theme. Today it might be reading and writing. The second interstitial, it's in the target country, and it talks about things that they may see in their country with the application of that reading and writing. And then the third interstitial is actual actors from the country with characters from their host country. So it shows that this is actually a show customized to our community. And it makes a big impact.
So you go from Sesame Street then to TikTok today.
Yeah.
And TikTok, you have the Chinese TikTok that's kind of structured in an educational way. then you have the U.S. TikTok that's not.
Yeah.
So is TikTok a threat to American society, or is it
I
not?
think my personal feeling as a TikTok user is I like it better than Instagram, but I'm also worried about the all the data sharing that goes on behind it. So if a U.S. company did own it and had to mind the rules of our FCC, I'd be comfortable with that. I think that's fine.
This almost concludes our day. Any other topics you'd like to talk about that we haven't talked about today?
We've talked about Doge and what Elon's doing. So we talked about he's got a $2 trillion goal. He's cutting about $4 billion a day. He's focused on USAID because that is where the president thought and kept hearing such negative things inside USAID. But one thing you have to remember about USAID, who is the U.S. constituency for AID? There isn't one, really. In fact, at USAID, you're not allowed to spend $1 of USAID money domestically in the United States. That's a law, and that was put in by Jesse Helms in the 1970s. They don't have a natural constituency. Congress is their only constituency, and they get deep into the pants, so to speak, of USAID and its leadership. If USAID has failed leadership and they don't take care of the congressional relationship, what's happening now is a result of that, and that's a problem. That's a big problem. I think you have to respect Congress for its constitutional role in our system, just as you respect the administration branch and the Supreme Court. If you try to manipulate them and say that you're not going to be forward to them and they have constitutional responsibilities, you suffer what comes, and that's a shame.
Well, thanks, Jeff. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me today.